For more on the NATO summit, we are joined for political analysis by Admiral James Stavridis. He is joining us in Boston via Skype. He's Dean of Tufts Fletcher School and a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Thanks so much for joining us. What do you make of these talks about the ceasefire?
I think it's too soon to tell. I'm skeptical, particularly because so often over the last couple of months, we've heard from the Russians about a wide variety of things. Their forces weren't in Crimea. Their forces were not going to come into Ukraine. They don't have forces in southern Ukraine. All those things turned out not to be true, frankly. So I'm very skeptical of anything I'm hearing from the Russian side at this point. Like everyone else, I'm hopeful that we can get to a ceasefire and get to diplomacy and negotiation. But doing it with Russian troops advancing on Ukrainian cities seems to me an unlikely path to a ceasefire.
Admiral, let me ask you a little bit about NATO, because you obviously were deeply involved in it. Some, of course, in recent years have called it irrelevant. Record not so great. Bloody 13 years in Afghanistan. The intervention in Libya, some observers would say, has not led to a more stable Libya. Quite the contrary. And now it seems like you have member states who kind of have different points of view about where to go going forward. And there are even reports that privately, British Prime Minister David Cameron is growing frustrated with the reluctant U.S. president, trying to kind of outline his strategic thinking. So give us your thoughts on what's going to happen in Wales.
I think there'll be four key topics on the table. The first is the one we're talking about, which is Ukraine, but particularly the broad path forward on the relationship between NATO and Russia. Second, it'll be Syria, the rise of the Islamic State. Let's not forget everything happening in Syria and Iraq is happening on the border of NATO because Turkey has an 800-kilometer border along that entire very destabilized region. We will be talking about Afghanistan. I'm cautiously optimistic about how Afghanistan comes out if we leave NATO troops as we plan to do there, not in a combat role, but in a training role. And then fourth and finally, I think there'll be a discussion of cyber and the preparations of the alliance in the cyber world. So it'll be a very eventful summit.
As you well know, when NATO was first created, the first Secretary General famously said it was created to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Vladimir Putin has deep suspicions about NATO, and a columnist in The Guardian wrote on Wednesday, and I'm quoting, "It was precisely the threat that Ukraine would be drawn into a military alliance hostile to Russia, despite the opposition of most Ukrainians, and its then elected government that triggered this crisis in the first place. Instead of keeping the peace, NATO has been the cause of escalating tension and war." And I wanted to give you a chance to kind of respond to that. Do you agree?
Absolutely not, Mike. And frankly, the statement is absurd. Let's start by looking at the Warsaw Pact nations. Nobody forced them to join NATO. Every single one of them stood in line, raised their hand, and came in. All the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. These are nations that today are asking for more NATO troops to come because of Russian aggression. Let's look at Ukraine. Ukraine decided they wanted to withdraw from a NATO membership process. NATO said, that's fine. The next thing that happens when the government changes there, all of a sudden Russian special forces invade and annex part of Crimea. That's provocative. That's trying to dominate your neighbors. That's not what NATO's doing.
Is there something that can be done on all the various sides, though, to lower the temperature?
I think there is, and I would start by having Russia withdraw its troops. That's the first thing, and let's face it, only one nation is putting its troops across a sovereign border. And oh, by the way, that same nation, Russia, has actually annexed Crimea, taken it from Ukraine, erasing a national border for the first time since the 1930s. So I'd say a pretty good step one would be, let's get the Russian troops out of Ukraine. I think step two would be for the Ukrainian forces and the resistance, if you will, to come to a ceasefire and try and have a negotiated settlement that would preserve the rights of the Russian minority within Ukraine. That's a legitimate concern. But a legitimate reaction to that concern is not an invasion, which is what Russia has done. So let's start by getting the Russian troops off the table. Then we can get to a ceasefire. Then we can diplomatize this thing. And I think get to a much better place. Because, Mike, no one wants to stumble back into a Cold War. That's in nobody's interests.
Admiral James Stavridis joining us from Boston and Tufts University. Thank you so much.